It is important, however, to understand the government's objectives in addressing the issue of inequality. Both within and outside Singapore, political leaders have often incorporated the phrase income inequality in their speeches, but do not necessarily have the same understanding of its impact on its society. We just heard a masterful speech on this same topic by Minister Ong Ye Kung just a few minutes ago. Some political leaders have sounded apocalyptic warnings about the effect of income inequality on society. Some have referred to income inequality as providing people the motivation to do better and improve their lives. Some other opportunistic politicians blame immigration and free trade as contributing factors to income inequality. Doubtless, such accusations can exacerbate divisions within a society. I found the chapter on inequality written by Professor Steven Pinker of Harvard University in his recent book, Enlightenment Now, instructive on this point, and wish to share his insights with honorable members of this House. Professor Pinker asserted that income inequality, usually measured by the Gini coefficient, is not a fundamental component of well-being. It is not a basic right, such as right to health, education, security, etc. He said, and I quote, "Income inequality is not itself a dimension of human well-being and should not be confused with unfairness or with poverty. Nor is decrease in inequality is always good. Most effective levelers of economic disparities are epidemics, massive wars, and state collapse," unquote. What is objectionable, therefore, is poverty, lack of mobility arising from low income. Hence, in dealing with income inequality, the primary focus is on tackling poverty, access to important services such as education, health, social mobility, and social mix. We should not conflate inequality per se with unfairness. Against this backdrop, it can be readily appreciated that our government's Gini, or rather the country's Gini coefficient figures, which solely measures income inequality, do not provide a full picture of the government's effort to deal with social mobility, poverty, access to government services among our low-income families, and social mix. I believe Honourable Member Mr. Cedric Foo made the same point earlier. In this context, the government's stated intent in the President's address to open up more progression pathways, celebrate a broader range of success, giving every child a good start in life irrespective of his family circumstance, and help children at risk deserves this House full support. This is not to say that the government should not be mindful of income inequality. Cost of living issues have a disproportionate impact on low-income families. I note specifically that this government has committed in the President's address to help families cope with costs of living. I wish to deal with the impact of GST on lower-income families. The government often refers to the unique structuring of the GST system with voucher schemes extended to low-income families so as to make GST implementation more, in inverted commas, progressive vis-à-vis them. It is mentioned that for our low-income families, for every dollar they pay in tax, they get about $4 in transfer benefits. Minister Ong Ye Kung just spoke about this when he spoke about, or when he touched on the topic of redistribution to lower-income families in Singapore in his speech just now. As low-income families do not pay much income tax, most of the tax they pay would therefore be GST. I respectfully suggest that in determining the impact of GST on low-income families and measuring the sufficiency of transfer benefits to help them with their cost of living issues, we should not just use how much GST a low-income family pays as a yardstick. The assumption that low-income families use quite a bit of their disposable income in directly paying GST ought to be tested. Let me illustrate this by using purchase of food as an example. It is more likely that a member from a low-income family would buy food from businesses at the wet markets or hawker from a hawker center who are not GST registered, as opposed to a supermarket or restaurant in a shopping center. Yet, hawker and market food prices would naturally be affected by GST, and the low-income family will have to pay higher costs. Hence, pegging amounts of transfer just on how much GST they directly pay would not be sufficient. Ultimately, to ensure that the transfers are sufficient to offset the impact of GST on cost of living, the government must be mindful of the inflationary pressures on the low-income families, especially if their wages do not keep pace. One connected issue to the government's agenda in forging a cohesive, caring, and inclusive society is the housing policy concerning the physical location of rental flats. This relates to the fourth dimension of income inequality that Minister Ong Ye Kung spoke about in his speech, dealing with social mix. As members know, a good number of standalone rental blocks have been built in the recent past. Yesterday, we heard the Honourable Member, Mr. Ang Wei Neng, forcefully endorsing the government's ethnic mix policy in HDB housing estates. Honourable Member Mr. Henry Quek made a clarion call to promote social mixing among classes. Ms. Cheryl Chan suggested renting older housing units to those needing interim housing. I agree with them, and I would go further. I suggest that the government consider going back to the old policy of co-locating rental flats within regular units. I do have a concern with the building of standalone rental flats. Usually they are built at the fringes of mature housing estates. They run the danger of becoming ghettos. We miss a chance of getting family members to mix with family members from these rental flats to mix with members of regular units, in regular units. With better interaction, we promote awareness, empathy for low-income families, and hopefully this will spontaneously generate more help for them. We can also motivate the low-income families to better their lives through their own efforts, mirroring the efforts of their friends in regular units. Returning to the issue of addressing the increased costs of social expenditure, there is scope to use data analytics to ensure better targeting and reduce moral hazard. I spoke about this before in the House. I asked why we are still using housing income, or rather household income, as a determinant for social assistance as opposed to family income. I do appreciate the complexity, but I exhort the government to consider utilizing data analytics to get a better picture of who should be helped. I met an elderly couple. They sought financial help over and above the CPF life annuity payment they were getting. Unfortunately, they were not getting sufficient support from their children. When I suggested that they participated in the lease buyback scheme, they demurred, stating that they want to pass on the full value of their flat to their children upon their demise. Responsible parents to the end.